Echoes of the mind. 38 witnesses did nothing. That's not what really happened. You have probably heard this story before, even if you do not know the name attached to it. A young woman is attacked outside her apartment building late at night. 38 of her neighbors hear or see what is happening. Not one of them calls for help. She dies while an entire neighborhood listens and does nothing. This story has a name. It is the murder of Kitty Genovese, and for almost 60 years, it has been taught in psychology classrooms around the world as the defining example of something called the bystander effect. The idea that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely any single person is to step in and help. Here is what almost nobody tells you when they teach this story. Most of the versions you just heard are not true. The real events of that night were messier, stranger, and in some ways more disturbing than the myth that grew out of them. And the fact that a partly false story became one of the most repeated lessons in modern psychology raises a much stranger question than the one everybody thinks they are answering. Why did we need this story to be simpler than it actually was? Why did an entire academic field, filled with people trained to check sources and question assumptions, keep repeating a version of events that a careful read of the original police record would have complicated almost immediately? If this is the kind of question that makes you want to understand people a little better, this is exactly what this channel is built around. So if that is interesting to you, go ahead and subscribe before we get into it, because there is a lot more of this coming. Let's start with what actually happened, on the ground, in the early hours of March 13, 1964. Kitty Genovese was 28 years old, working as a bar manager in Queens, New York. She was returning home from her shift in the middle of the night, parking her car near her apartment building in a neighborhood called Kew Gardens. As she walked toward her building, a man named Winston Mosley approached and attacked her with a knife. Here is the first detail that gets flattened in the popular version of the story. This was not one single, continuous attack that dozens of people watched unfold from start to finish while doing nothing. It happened in two separate encounters, several minutes apart. During the first attack, a neighbor did shout out a window, and Mosley, startled, actually left the scene. Genovese, wounded, made her way toward the back of her building, out of view from the street. Minutes later, Mosley returned, found her in a hallway entrance where she had been trying to get help, and attacked her again, this time fatally. The detail that gets erased almost entirely from the popular telling is this. At least one witness, a man in a nearby building, did call the police after the first attack, though accounts differ on exactly how quickly and how the call was handled once it came in. And a neighbor named Sophie Farrar came down to be with Genovese in her final moments, cradling her as she lay dying, rather than watching from a distance and doing nothing. None of this means everything about that night was fine, or that nobody could have acted faster. Confusion was real. Some witnesses genuinely believed they were hearing a domestic argument or a drunken dispute, common and unfortunately dismissible sounds in a dense city neighborhood late at night, not a life-threatening attack. But the clean, damning version, 38 witnesses watching in total silence while a woman is murdered in plain view, is simply not what the documented record actually shows. It is worth pointing out just how specific and repeatable this number, 38, became over the following decades. It appeared in psychology textbooks, in true crime retrospectives, and in casual conversation, almost always presented with total confidence, as though someone had carefully counted heads at windows that night. In reality, that figure came from early police estimates during the initial investigation, filtered through a reporter working on a deadline, and it hardened into fact largely because nobody who repeated it afterward went back to check where it had actually come from. So where did that number, and that version of the story, actually come from? About 2 weeks after the murder, the New York Times published a story about the case, and it is this article, more than the murder itself, that created the myth most people know today. The reporting drew heavily on conversations with police, and it framed the incident in the most dramatic and simplified terms available: 38 witnesses, one continuous attack, total inaction from an entire uncaring neighborhood. The reporter and editor behind that story were, by most accounts, working in good faith, chasing a real and troubling angle on a genuine tragedy. The problem was not necessarily malice. It was the simple pressure of turning a messy, confusing set of witness statements, gathered secondhand from police notes, into a single coherent narrative that would fit on a page and grab a reader's attention within the first sentence. That kind of pressure rewards clean, dramatic framing over accurate, complicated framing almost every single time, and this story is a near-perfect example of what happens when it does. It is worth understanding why a story like this spreads so easily, because the mechanism is almost more interesting than the murder itself. A single, clean explanation, a city full of apathetic strangers who simply did not care, is a satisfying story. It confirms something many people already suspected or feared about urban life, and it gives readers a clear villain to be horrified by, 1 in 38 of them, described in exactly one grim expression, watched and did nothing. The real version, minutes apart attacks, confused witnesses, one call to police, one woman who did come down to help, is far less tidy and far less quotable. There is also something worth noticing about the era this story landed in. 1964 was a moment of real anxiety in the United States about crime, about cities, and about whether the community itself was quietly dissolving as people moved further apart and grew more anonymous to their own neighbors. The Genovese story did not just describe an isolated tragedy. It seemed to confirm an entire cultural fear that was already circulating, which is part of why it was retold so widely, and so uncritically, for so long afterward. And here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the exaggerated version did not just spread through newspapers. It reshaped an entire field of psychology. Two researchers, John Darley and Bib Latane, read about the Genovese case and became fascinated by a very specific question. Not whether the reporting was accurate, but whether the underlying idea that the presence of other people actually makes individuals less likely to help in an emergency might be real, regardless of whether this particular case demonstrated it cleanly. So they built an experiment to test it directly. In one of their most famous studies, participants believed they were having a group discussion over an intercom system with several other people in separate rooms, supposedly to discuss personal problems related to college life in an informal, anonymous setting. In reality, there were no other real participants. Everything the subject heard was a pre-recorded track, carefully designed to sound spontaneous and unscripted. Partway through the conversation, one of the voices on the recording appeared to suffer a medical emergency, choking, distress, calling out for help, sounding increasingly panicked as the seconds passed. Here is the finding that made this study so important. Participants who believed they were the only other person listening in helped almost immediately, and did so at a very high rate. But participants who believed several other people were also on the call were significantly slower to respond, and in many cases, did not respond at all before the experiment ended. The researchers ran variations of this same basic setup multiple times, changing the number of people participants believed were listening in, and the pattern held remarkably consistently. The more people a participant believed were aware of the emergency alongside them, the longer they waited, and the less likely they were to act at all. This was not a one-time fluke result. It became one of the most replicated findings in social psychology over the following decades, studied in dozens of variations, in different countries, with different kinds of staged emergencies. Nothing about the personalities of these two groups was different. They were assigned randomly. The only thing that changed was how many other people each participant believed were also aware of the emergency. This is worth sitting with, because the natural assumption is that this must be about callousness, or about people in cities being colder than people elsewhere. That is not what the research actually points to. What changes is something quieter and, in a way, more unsettling. Responsibility feels shared, and when responsibility is shared among a group, it feels diluted for every individual inside that group. If 10 people are aware of an emergency, each person can quietly, often unconsciously, assume that someone else, probably someone more qualified or better positioned, will be the one to act. There is a second mechanism working alongside this one, and it might be even more important. It is called pluralistic ignorance, and it explains something that feels deeply familiar if you think about it honestly. Imagine you are in a public place and something happens that seems like it might be an emergency, but you are not entirely sure. You look around and everyone else appears calm. Nobody else seems alarmed. So you assume you must be misreading the situation, and you stay calm too, even though, unknown to you, several other people around you are having that exact same internal experience at the exact same moment, each one quietly deferring to the apparent calm of everyone else, when in reality, nobody in the group actually knows what is going on. Everyone is reading everyone else's blank expression as confirmation that everything is fine, and nobody's blank expression means what everyone else assumes it means. This idea shows up far beyond emergencies, and once you understand it, you start noticing it everywhere. Think about a classroom or a meeting where a speaker asks if anyone has questions, and the room goes silent, not because nobody has a question, but because each person assumes their own confusion must be unique, since nobody else appears confused. In reality, in many of these rooms, most people are quietly lost together, each one convinced they are the only one, simply because everyone is performing the same calm exterior at the same time. Emergencies work the same way, just with higher stakes. A room full of people who are each privately alarmed can look, from the outside and even from the inside, exactly like a room full of people who are perfectly calm. And the tragedy of that particular illusion is that it can hold together for far longer than anyone inside it would expect, sometimes long enough that the moment to act quietly passes without anyone ever having chosen not to act at all. Understanding this is uncomfortable because it suggests something about ordinary human wiring, not about broken or cruel individuals. Almost nobody watching this video would describe themselves as the kind of person who would ignore someone in genuine danger. And yet the research is fairly consistent on this point. Group size alone changes behavior, regardless of who is in the group, regardless of their profession, their upbringing, or how strongly they believe in the abstract that they would be the one to step forward. If this is the kind of thing that makes you want to understand people a little better, go ahead and subscribe, because that is really the entire mission of this channel. And while you are here, start thinking honestly about whether you have ever hesitated to step in during a public moment simply because other people were nearby and seemed unbothered, because I am going to ask you about that at the end of this video, and I would rather you have an honest answer ready than have to think it up on the spot. Now here is the part of this story that deserves real honesty, because debunking the exaggerated version does not mean nothing went wrong on that night in 1964. People did fail to fully grasp what was happening in real time. Help that did come, came late, and Kitty Genovese still died as a result, regardless of how many or how few people misunderstood the sounds they were hearing. Correcting the myth is not the same as saying the tragedy was smaller than it seemed, or that no one bears any responsibility for how slowly the response came together that night. What is genuinely strange, and worth sitting with, is that the exaggerated version of this story may have done real good in the world, despite being inaccurate. Public outrage over the case, fueled specifically by the version involving 38 silent witnesses, became part of a broader wave of concern about emergency response in American cities during the 1960s. That concern is frequently cited as one of the contributing factors behind the push to create a single, simple emergency number that any American could dial from anywhere in the country, which eventually became the 911 system introduced a few years later. Before that system existed, someone in an emergency in many parts of the country had to know the direct local number for their specific police precinct or fire department, a number that varied from town to town and was often not something an ordinary person had memorized or readily available in a moment of panic. The idea of one universal number, easy to remember and consistent everywhere, gained real political momentum partly because stories like the Genovese case had convinced lawmakers and the public that bystanders needed an easier, faster path to getting help moving, even if the specific story driving that urgency was not entirely accurate in its details. So a story that was not fully true anyway helped produce something that made people genuinely safer. That is a strange, uncomfortable kind of outcome, and it raises a real question about the relationship between accuracy and impact that does not have a clean answer. A story does not need to be perfectly precise to reveal something true about human behavior in general, but that does not mean accuracy stops mattering. Psychology as a field has had to publicly reckon with the fact that one of its most famous, most frequently taught case studies was built on flawed early reporting. And in more recent decades, journalists and researchers have gone back through original police records and tracked down surviving witnesses to piece together a far more accurate picture of what actually happened that night, a picture that took decades to fully come into focus. It is worth asking what this says about how we, as a culture, decide which stories deserve to become permanent lessons. The Genovese case did not earn its place in textbooks because it was the most carefully verified account of bystander behavior available. It earned that place because it was the most vivid, the most quotable, and the most emotionally satisfying explanation available at the time. And once it was installed in the curriculum, it became remarkably difficult to dislodge, even decades later, even after serious journalists had gone back and shown how much of the original account did not hold up. So let's bring this back to right now, to your own life, because this is where the story stops being about 1964 entirely. Diffusion of responsibility does not require a murder, or a city street, or even strangers to show up. It shows up in a group chat, where an urgent message sits unanswered for hours because everyone assumes someone else will handle it. It shows up in a crowded public space when something unusual happens, and everyone quietly checks everyone else's face before deciding how concerned to be. It shows up at work, when an obvious problem goes unaddressed for weeks because it technically belongs to everyone, and therefore, in practice, belongs to no one in particular. Think about the last time you saw something on a busy street that looked slightly wrong, someone who seemed unwell, or lost, or in distress, and you found yourself glancing at the people around you before deciding whether to act. That glance is the entire mechanism happening in real time, compressed into about 1 second. You were not checking to see if help was needed. You were checking to see how everyone else was reacting, and letting that reaction, rather than your own judgment, decide what you would do next. None of this is a story about cold or uncaring people in 1964 or today. It is a story about how the simple presence of other people quietly changes an individual's sense of personal responsibility, often without that person ever noticing it happening in the moment. And here is the genuinely hopeful part, the part that makes this knowledge worth something rather than just an uncomfortable fact to carry around. Research on this subject suggests that people who have actually learned about the bystander effect, who understand the mechanism directly, are measurably more likely to recognize the pattern happening in real time, and to act anyway, specifically because they know what their own hesitation is likely to feel like before it happens. That single detail is, in my opinion, the entire reason this story is still worth telling accurately, decades later. Simply knowing that your own instinct to look around and wait for someone else can be manipulated by a room full of other people having the exact same instinct is often enough to interrupt it, even if only barely, even if only in a small fraction of the moments where it might matter. The awareness itself becomes a kind of quiet countermeasure. So maybe that is the real answer to the question this video opened with. Why did a partly false story become one of the most repeated lessons in modern psychology? Maybe it endured, not because it was accurate, but because some part of every person who heard it recognized the discomfort inside it as true, even before anyone had the research to explain exactly why. If this video changed the way you think about this case, or about the quiet mechanics of hesitation in general, consider subscribing, because this channel exists entirely to dig into moments exactly like this one, the real psychology sitting underneath the history, and the stories everyone already thinks they know. There are more stories like this one coming, cases where the popular version and the documented truth pull apart in ways that end up teaching us more than the original myth ever did. And before you go, I want an honest answer from you. Think of a specific moment, in public, at work, in a group chat, anywhere, where you hesitated to act because you assumed someone else would. Tell me about it in the comments below, because I promise you are not the only one who has a story like that, and I think it is worth all of us saying it out loud, if only so the next person reading the comments feels a little less alone in having done the exact same thing. That is the echo this channel exists to trace.